Good evening and welcome to a joint work session of the Mayor and City Council and the Planning Commission. Tonight we have one topic for discussion, and that is the sketch plan for the 700 North Frederick Avenue. But before we get to that, we need to make a motion for a closed executive session. I'm going to turn it over to Councilmember Sesma.
Thank you, Mayor. Notice to the general public is hereby given that the Mayor and City Council of Gaithersburg plan to conduct a closed executive session virtually by teleconference online immediately following our work session on Monday, July 27th, 2020. The meeting is proposed to be closed pursuant to the general provisions article of the Annotated Code of Maryland, sections 3-305B1I. The appointment, employment, assignment, promotion, discipline, demotion, compensation, removal, resignation, or performance evaluations of appointees, employees, or officials over whom it has jurisdiction, and 3-305B8, to consult with staff, consultants, or other individuals about pending or potential litigation. The topics to be discussed are a personnel matter to conduct the city attorney's annual review and pending litigation. The closed executive session will be held pursuant to a motion properly adopted now, which I am moving by the Mayor and City Council on Monday, July 27th, 2020.
Okay. Do we have a second, Councilmember? Okay. Okay, Neil seconded, so I'm going to call the roll. Councilmember Sesma.
Aye.
Councilmember Spiegel.
Aye.
Councilmember Sales.
Aye.
Councilmember Wu.
Aye.
And Councilmember Harris.
Aye.
Okay, carries unanimously. So we will conduct that executive session immediately after this meeting. So I'm going to ask our tech team to bring up Laura May Food, who is going to introduce our applicant this evening. And I'm just going to tell you guys how this project is, or how this work session is going to be organized. We are going to hear from the applicant on this proposal for a sketch plan. Then we'll take any questions for the applicant. Then we'll go to the public. I know there's a few people here for public comment. And then we'll come back for staff guidance and discussion. So with that, Laura, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. So good evening. This is a joint work session on application SK 8495-2020 to establish a new sketch plan for 700 North Frederick Avenue. A joint public hearing for this application was held on June 15th, 2020. Several questions and concerns were raised during the hearing, particularly regarding the open space strategy, site circulation, and the applicant's proposed notes addressing the number of buildings and uses on site. A joint work session was subsequently scheduled to allow for more discussion and give both staff and the applicant the opportunity to provide additional information. Both the applicant and staff will give presentations this evening, starting with the applicant. Staff is seeking guidance from the council and commission on their support for various aspects of the sketch plan, as you will see outlined in staff's presentation. And I would like to note that I know you've seen in your packets some materials submitted by a prospective tenant, Amazon. But as this is a sketch plan application at this stage, the discussion should really focus on what is being proposed on the sketch and not the specifics of any particular tenant. There are currently 43 exhibits in the record for this application. These exhibits may be viewed at any time on the city's website. Both the Planning Commission and Mayor and Council records remain open indefinitely. And I'll now turn it over to the applicant, Matt & Companies, for their presentation.
Thank you, Laura. And first, I just want to thank staff for the time, as well as Mayor and Council and the members of the Planning Commission. So if we could have packet page 2. So tonight we wanted to just be a complete open book kind of regarding who the initial tenant for the property is going to be. So we're pleased to announce that Amazon is potentially would be the tenant for this property and their last mile delivery facility station. So previously at the June 15th joint public hearing, we weren't able to announce who it was, just due to the negotiations with Amazon, but now we're able to talk about any specifics if need be. So we're happy to announce them. And next slide, please. So you'll notice that they're part of the team for tonight's presentation. So I'd like to turn it over to Broderick to just say a few things from Amazon.
Good evening, Mayor and City Council, members of the Planning Commission. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this evening's working session. My name is Broderick Green, and I'm here representing Amazon.com. We realize that Matin is the applicant, Amazon is the prospective tenant at 700 North Frederick Avenue, and appreciate the uniqueness of appearing at the sketch plan application phase of development, but we wanted to ensure that we were here to answer any questions. We have submitted a statement in support of sketch plan application SK 8495-2020. So I will not take up any time rehashing that information here. I am joined by my colleague, Natalie Gordon, this evening. And as I said, we're here to answer any questions from this body with the intent of making this discussion as fruitful as possible. At Amazon, we are focused on being the most customer-centric company in the world. Our proposed growth in Gaithersburg is a result of an ideal location with great access, outstanding workforce, and strong customer demand. It's important to note that our associates and customers at this facility and in this region potentially are also your residents and constituents, and we strive to be a community partner in the communities where we operate. Thank you again, and we look forward to having a productive discussion.
Okay. Thanks, Broderick. So next slide, please. So the topics for discussion this evening, based on the joint public hearing on the 15th, there were three kind of general areas that we wanted to talk about that were brought up by Mayor and Council and Planning Commission. So the first one was the general notes 3, 4, and 5, and then the location and orientation of employee amenity space and other open spaces within the sketch plan, and then the conceptual site circulation. Next slide, please. So starting with general note number 3. So the modification to note 3 does include one or more buildings, which we feel is ultimately for the betterment of the property. It really does establish a framework for today that allows for flexibility in the future, whether it's 5, 15, or 30 years from now. Given the prime location of this site and amazing opportunities that may come by, we feel that the flexibility is needed to redevelop with either one or more buildings. And this really does keep the city competitive in the marketplace. So applying this framework today not only is it's not intended to be a narrow in scope, but really what's approved with the sketch plan will give the city the ultimate flexibility, especially in the future when tenants may leave, kind of like with Lightus today, with the existing tenant that's there, for future projects to develop with one or more buildings, really, again, to stay competitive. So this would apply to any of the uses on the permitted use chart, which includes, but is not limited to, the medical, laboratory, development, manufacturing, and distribution uses. So all of these sectors continue to outperform other market sectors in the region. So the redevelopment of this property under this sketch plan would still enhance the horizontal mix of uses along the Frederick Avenue corridor and really create new job opportunities for the city's residents.
Good evening all. For the record, Philip Hummel of Miles and Stockbridge, counsel for applicant Matin. I just also wanted to touch General Note 3's relationship to the annexation agreement. We believe that General Note 3 is necessary to confirm applicant's option to redevelop the property with a single building containing a single use under the I3 zone in accordance with the annexation agreement. Next slide, please. So just to give you a brief history of the land use and zoning history here. Back in 1992, this site, 700 North Frederick Avenue, was included in a 122-acre site that was annexed into the city and classified in the I3 zone. Just to give some historical context here, the 122-acre site was the former IBM campus. It roughly extended from Montgomery Village Avenue to the south, Watkins Mill Road to the north, Maryland 355 to the east, and 270 to the west. That was the whole site. When the property was annexed into the city in 1992, it was classified in the I3 zone. The city then entered into annexation agreement X161, providing that the property may be redeveloped in compliance with the I3 zone. And I just wanted to briefly read the operative language from the annexation agreement. This is paragraph 3 from Exhibit 11. And that reads, notwithstanding anything that may be contained in this paragraph 3 or this agreement to the contrary, this agreement is not intended to prohibit, and Gaithersburg agrees to permit, future additional development or redevelopment of the subject property, that's the whole annex site, the subject property, in excess of the existing development and additional development in compliance with the Gaithersburg I3 zone and applicable governmental codes and regulations as such requirements thereof may be modified by the terms and conditions of this agreement, end quote. It's our position that this language, in conformance with the I3 zone, what that means is applicant's ability to redevelop the property with an I3 use in a building that's constructed pursuant to the I3 development standards. So then we move on to 1997, where the property was included in a comprehensive rezoning that reclassified 700 North Frederick from the I3 zone to the MXD zone. This rezoning did not alter any terms of the 1992 annexation agreement. Thus, it's our position that the I3 zone sets a base or a floor that cannot be modified by stricter MXD standards without the consent of the applicant. And I'd like to read from the preliminary background report prepared by staff. This is Exhibit 36. Quote, as discussed previously, the property is subject to annexation agreement X-161. Per the annexation agreement, the city agreed to permit future redevelopment of the property in compliance with the I3 zone. Subsequent to the annexation, the property was rezoned to MXD. However, the terms of the annexation agreement still apply, and as such, the applicant has the right to develop the property with I3 zone uses and according to I3 zone development standards. The I3 zone standards essentially serve as the quote basement, which may not be modified unless mutually agreed upon by both parties, the applicant and the city. In other words, the applicant cannot be required to adhere to standards that are more restrictive in the I3 zone, but those standards may be modified if both the city and the applicant agree, end quote. So the way we interpret this provision, both the annexation agreement and staff's analysis, that the applicant has the ability under the annexation agreement to redevelop the property with the use allowed in the I3 zone in a building that meets I3 zone development standards without more. And that includes the ability to develop the property with a single building containing a single use. Now we fast forward to 2019, where the city approved sketch plan SK-8180-2019. This sketch plan included a general note 8, Exhibit 12, which identified applicants' right under the annexation agreement with its option to redevelop the property with the uses permitted by the I3 zone and under development standards of the I3 zone. And the city's resolution that adopted the sketch plan also acknowledged that the 1997 comprehensive rezoning from I3 to MXD did not alter any terms of the 1992 annexation agreement. I also wanted to take this opportunity to briefly address what's in the record as Exhibit 43, a memo from the City Attorney's Office. We respectfully disagree with any conclusion stated in that exhibit that the MXD zone standards may also apply to I3 uses, because this can have the effect of prohibiting development that is permitted by right in the I3 zone. Applicant acknowledges that the MXD zone application processes apply to the property, namely sketch plan approval, schematic development plan approval, and final site plan approval. These processes, however, cannot be employed to deny applicants' ability and option to redevelop the property with an I3 use in a structure that meets the I3 development standards. Similarly, the MXD zone standards do not, quote, interact, end quote, in any way if applicant chooses to proceed with an I3 use and I3 development standards. Stricter standards can effectively prohibit the I3 development per applicant's right under the annexation agreement. In sum, the annexation agreement requires the city to approve plans that comply with the I3 zone, standing alone without regard to MXD development standards. We're also confident that the I3 zone permits by right a single use contained in a single building. We respectfully disagree with any argument to the contrary in Exhibit 43. With respect to the purpose clause that is raised in Exhibit 43 with references to, quote, industries or offices in the plural form, do not compel multiple uses or multiple buildings in the I3 zone. To conclude otherwise runs afoul of the zoning ordinance rules of interpretation, where the singular number includes the plural number and the plural includes the singular. And we cite section 24-1.1 of the zoning ordinance. With respect to the provision in the I3 zone governing minimum distance between main buildings, the I3 zone development standards simply provide an option for providing multiple main buildings. If an applicant chooses to provide multiple main buildings, they must be a certain distance apart from each other. This, however, is not the same and should not be interpreted as a requirement to provide multiple main buildings. With respect to the point that there's no specified right to a single building in the I3 zone. Although the I3 zone does not specifically provide for a single building, there is also no explicit requirement to provide multiple buildings in every development. If there was a prohibition of single uses in single buildings in the I3 zone, how did such existing development come to pass? As there are properties in the city today that are zoned I3 and are improved with a single building containing a single use. So most significantly, we believe any argument in Exhibit 43 arguing that the I3 zone does not permit by right a single use in a single building are belied by the city's historical application and interpretation of the I3 zone in other developments. There are multiple examples of I3 zone properties in the city that contain a single use. You go immediately to the north of 700 North Frederick, 700 North Frederick at 800 North Frederick. There's a FedEx facility that was approved by the city in 2016 that contains a single use. There are also other properties in the city near West Watkins Mill Road, Metropolitan Court, Edison Park Drive, Clopper Road, and North Frederick Avenue that are all improved with single buildings containing single uses zoned I3. If the I3 zone requires multiple uses and multiple buildings, and the I3 zone does not currently contain any waiver or variance provision authorizing improvements for a single building with a single use, it calls into question the status of existing I3 sites that have a single building containing a single use. We believe it would cause a great deal of uncertainty for owners, tenants, and lending institutions if these improvements were deemed to not comply or no longer comply with I3 zoning. In short, the city cannot require multiple buildings or multiple uses in the sketch plan because the I3 zone itself does not require multiple buildings or multiple uses. Now, alternatively, even if the I3 zone requires multiple buildings with multiple uses, there is still compliance with the annexation agreement. And I wanted again to remind those with us tonight that the annexation agreement covered a 122-acre site. At that time, that was a single recorded parcel that contained the former IBM campus. The annexation agreement contemplated re-subdivision of that larger site into multiple parcels, and that is referenced in paragraph 2 of the annexation agreement. And indeed, this is what came to pass. The original 122-acre site was re-subdivided and currently is composed of 3 parcels. Each of those parcels has been redeveloped with 1 or more buildings containing 1 or more uses. This includes the Kaiser Permanente Medical Office Building, the Hampton Inn and Suites Hotel, the FedEx facility we referenced, and the current Leidos building. Thus, when viewed in the context of the original annexed site, which was the subject of the annexation agreement, you do have multiple buildings on the property with multiple uses. Thus, proposed General Note 3 recognizes applicant's option under the annexation agreement to redevelop the property in accordance with the I3 zone. And with that, I'll turn it back to Brian.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. Next slide, please. So the next topic was General Note 4. So the purpose of this note is to modify the standard maximum percentages of floor area for the commercial uses from the MXD zoning regulations. So last year, we did work very hard with staff to craft these percentages for the property. So what we're proposing are the same percentages that were approved in the 2019 sketch plan. So you'll notice on the screen, there's a chart that shows the MXD zoning regulations and then what the proposed maximum percentage of floor area that we would like. So regarding the retail, there currently is a considerable amount of principal retail uses along Frederick Avenue corridor and within the area. So as we know, given today's environment, we're seeing a lot of retailers struggle just due to the current conditions. So, the way that we shop has also drastically changed, and this pandemic would seem to leave a lasting imprint in people's minds potentially for a while. So limiting retail, reducing it to the 10% still seems to make sense here. For the next two, the employment office and other commercial institutional, we do propose to allow up to 100% of these uses. Again, this is still consistent with what was approved back in 2019. So allowing 100% of either employment or commercial uses, again, it would be capped at that 650,000 square feet total. And it would also include the uses that we described before with the medical, laboratory, development, manufacturing, and distribution. Really makes this property especially enticing for a lot of employers for years to come. So not just employers or companies looking at the property now here in the near term, but it really does help in the long term as well. So again, given what we're seeing in today's environment and what industry experts see thriving through this pandemic and in years to come, really our industry sectors such as technology companies, pharmaceuticals and healthcare, e-commerce, industrial distribution centers, and e-learning. So limiting any one of these sectors really could potentially be detrimental to the long-term success and goals of the property, and quite frankly, the city's goals. So also provided in this area, it's known as the Northern Employment District. So it only made sense to stay consistent with the city's master plan to increase the employment office and other commercial institutional percentages up to 100. Turn it over to Phil. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Brian. Also wanted to discuss the good cause shown requirement from the zoning ordinance for modifying these standard floor area percentages in the MXD zone. The mayor and council approved the proposed floor areas in 2019, the same ones that are being proposed in this sketch plan. Good cause was found to exist then, and good cause continues to exist today. As Brian mentioned, the proposed floor area percentages is consistent with the long-standing master plan recommendations for entirely commercial redevelopment on this site. We also believe that it advances the property's long-standing land use designation going back to the 1997 master plan, which exists today, the same commercial/industrial research office land use designation. As Brian mentioned, this property is located within the Northern Employment District, has been so since the 2001 Frederick Avenue Corridor Master Plan, and we believe that the floor area percentages proposed in this sketch plan corresponds to the property's location within that district. We also believe that the proposed floor areas are consistent and compatible with existing development within the property's vicinity. Of course, the property again is adjacent to FedEx site, which is a warehouse distribution use. The property is located along the important Frederick Avenue corridor, which contains a wide mix of commercial uses, retail uses, employment uses, and on the edges, residential uses as well. So we believe focusing on commercial uses, specifically employment uses, is consistent and compatible with development to bring new employment and jobs to nearby residences. We also believe that given the significant and considerable amount of existing retail already in the vicinity of the property, limiting retail usage to the 10% protects existing businesses and emphasizes the employment, office, and other commercial institutional uses while allowing for the possibility of some complementary retail in the future. And again, the annexation agreement does play a role here as well for allowing 100% of the floor area to be dedicated to employment, office, and other commercial institutional uses. As we mentioned before, the I3 zone allows an entirely 100% employment/office or other commercial institutional project by right. And the annexation agreement provides that the I3 uses and development standards serve as the base that cannot be abrogated by the MXD zone. Thus, the standard floor area percentages from the MXD zone must be accordingly revised to maintain applicants' right to develop the property under the I3 zone per the annexation agreement. To do otherwise would effectively prohibit by right development in accordance with the I3 zone, and we believe that that would be a violation of the annexation agreement from 1992. Thank you.
Yep. Next slide, please. So just a little more in general note for, this is a context map of this area. So you see the site listed here. This map does a really good job of showing you the horizontal mix of uses from commercial, retail, hospitality, industrial, and then residential uses to the east and west of the property. So all of this is achieved just within a few miles of the property, and it really lends itself to support this area with employment opportunities and really to stay consistent with the surrounding uses, especially those adjacent to this site. So we just wanted to highlight this corridor, and again, in the horizontal mix of uses that this site will also be able to play into. Next slide, please. So general note number 5. So the change to this note from the previous 2019 sketch plan, again, is critical to the economic success of the property. So what you see highlighted in blue was the change to this note, where it says, notwithstanding the ability to shift densities between development blocks, the applicant may combine development blocks by redeveloping the property in one consolidated block. So again, this really matches the long-term nature of the sketch plan and allows appropriate flexibility to respond to market conditions today and in the future. So the needs of the market could change 20 years from now. And so this allows the property in the city to adapt and pursue other desirable opportunities, whether it's speculative development or frankly build-to-suit opportunities, which tend to be single building, single users. Again, so for the exact reasons and conditions that we're facing today, the flexibility here is critical for the city to stay competitive and take advantage of any market sector within the realms of the sketch plan. Limiting development in today's conditions potentially could mothball the site for a long time, or if you were to limit the development, 20 years from now, any unforeseen economic downturn or national crisis could also mothball the site as well. So this property has seen great success over the last 50 years with IBM and Leidos, and now we have a new opportunity that's available for another single user to continue that success. Next slide, please. So regarding the open space, the employee amenity area. So this was an adjustment. We did make an adjustment to the employee amenity area that was in connection to Amazon. But when you look at the greater context of the sketch plan, looking back at the previous 2019 approved sketch plan, the employee amenity area was severely unbalanced and really did not provide suitable access for employees, whether it was a single building or multiple buildings. These areas really need to be conveniently located to employee entrances where travel distances is at a minimum. This really helps encourage the use and supports activation of that employee amenity space. It also creates a nice, soft, and inviting visual presence from Frederick Avenue. So when visitors enter the site, this employee amenity spaces, unfortunately, they tend to be afterthoughts a lot of times. So making it more central and making it a focus of the development and thinking of it ahead of time, we feel that it really is will be used for its intended use. So the space will also, we plan to design it with outdoor rooms with a variety of seating and covered areas and enticing nice plantings, all of which will be appropriately sized for the new social distancing norms. Next slide, please. Regarding the linear park along Frederick Avenue, it does remain consistent again with the previous sketch plan. So the overall experience of the proposed linear park really is to promote activation and usage of the space itself. We want to draw city residents into the park to serve walkers, joggers, and even the employees of the property. This can only be done really by providing visible seating and paths that are designed with attractive new plantings and really a beautification of the area of that park with manicured and maintained landscaping versus overgrown grasses, clusters of large trees, and berms, which really don't enhance the pedestrian experience. So with the design as well, it essentially follows what's called the crime prevention through environmental design, which allows clear sight lines, adequate lighting, minimize concealed areas from public roads, and ongoing maintenance and management to keep the park safe and inviting for people to enjoy. Next slide, please. The naturalized space. So this, the property does contain a very important environmental resource to the southern portion of the site, which is on the screen. It's labeled number 4 on the plan, which is near I-270. And so the sketch plan really does serve as the framework to protect and to enhance this area. So we plan on and will maintain and protect the 100-year floodplain and the wetlands through additional plantings by protecting this naturalized area and again, just really enhancing it. Next slide, please. And then the last topic that was brought up was the conceptual circulation. So from the joint public hearing, we did notice that some of the circulation did intersect through the linear park. So we cleaned up that line work to pull the drive lanes outside of that, which was our original intent, but it was a good comment. So we did clean that up. From the primary, you will notice that the primary site circulation road does run parallel to Frederick Avenue with drive aisles that run up and down into the site. So the site as it exists today does have 2 existing primary access points, and the sketch plan does propose an additional new access point. But starting on the left-hand side, which would be the northernmost point, the first existing access point is that existing signalized intersection, which will stay as an outbound movement, and that's that shared intersection with FedEx. And then if you're moving to the right in the middle is the new proposed access point, which would be a right in, right out from the site. And we actually have submitted this to the State Highway Administration, and they have accepted it during their conceptual review. So really the next steps would be for us to submit the actual design for SHA to review and approve. And then the third access point is, again, that existing southernmost full movement signalized intersection that will stay as is, acting as the main point of access for the site, which again, it exists there today with the current office building. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Brian. Again, this is, for the record, Phil Hummel. It's been raised in some of the materials in the record, the sketch plan's compliance with the master plan. We're confident that the proposed sketch plan is very compatible and consistent with master plan recommendations going back to 1997. We reference this or address this in detail in Exhibit 40 in the record. We incorporate it by reference. We don't want to get into it in a great detail in this presentation. But again, going back to 1997, there's been a consistent land use designation of commercial industrial research office, which we believe the sketch plan is consistent with. Since 2001, the property has been located within the Northern Employment District. We believe the sketch plan provides a framework that is consistent with that designation. The city's master plans have recognized the importance of the new interchange at I-270 Watkins Mill Road. We believe that the sketch plan takes full advantage of that important infrastructure improvement by bringing employees, potential new employees, to new job opportunities on the property. And moving forward to the 2009 master plan, we believe there's consistency with not only the land use element of the master plan, but these other elements that you see on the screen from the master plan. And we're happy to discuss any of those in detail if there are questions, but we are confident that the sketch plan as proposed is consistent with the city's master plans.
Next slide, please. So with that, we'd like to open it up to answer any questions that Mayor and Council and Planning Commission that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you all for the presentation. And I want to give an extra welcome to Broderick and Natalie from Amazon. We haven't seen you all before, and we appreciate you being here. We appreciate Amazon's interest in the city of Gaithersburg. We're flattered by it, frankly. But I will note to everyone here that what's before us, the sketch plan, is independent of the potential tenant that will be there. It's really what's before us is the sketch plan itself. So we should restrict or limit the scope of our questions to information about the sketch plan. So I want to open it up to council members and planning commissioners. If you have a question for the applicant, raise your hand and we'll get to you. And otherwise, when we're done with this, we'll go to the public and then we'll bring staff on. So does anybody have any questions here? Going once, going twice. Okay, no questions as of yet, but we will ask the applicant to hang around just in case there's some questions that come up later. What we're going to do now is I am going to open it up to the public. We have some people who are with us and would like to testify. And before we do, our tech team has created, because of some mix-ups about how to use the Zoom raise your hand function, the tech team has created a neat little video of how to do it. I'm going to ask our tech team to bring up the video and show it to everybody.
Good evening. If you've connected to the meeting tonight via Zoom and you're on a desktop or a laptop and you wish to make a public comment, we can't currently see or hear you. What you need to do, please, is wiggle your mouse around and look towards the bottom center of your screen. You should see a raised hand button. Go ahead and click on that now for us, please. Alternatively, if you've connected in via telephone, you can press *9.
I just love that. Our staff is the best. The best. Last week, for anybody who's here from the public, just raise your hand. I see we have one raised hand at this moment. Just want to note that last week we tried this system for the first time, and I didn't realize we had some people from the public at our meeting. I did not realize why we weren't getting as many raised hands as I expected, but we didn't get them. And so the next day, unbeknownst to me, our tech team reached out to everybody who was on the Zoom and said, "Were you trying to raise your hand? Did you want to raise your hand?" And followed up and found out that several of them didn't realize how to do it in Zoom. So that's our staff going well above and beyond. I really appreciate it. So tech team, if you could bring up Joe Pava, that would be great. I see one hand raised. And when Joe Joe, when you come up, if you can just unmute yourself, state your name and address or neighborhood for the record. We ask that you keep your comments to no more than 3 minutes. You can begin your testimony whenever you're ready.
Yes. Hi, my name is Joe Paiva. I live at 304 Beckwith Street in Gaithersburg. I cannot comment on whether or not the applicant is legally able to have one building or one use. But as someone who's been doing economic development both all over the United States and internationally for most of the last 10 years, I do have substantial concerns with a single building, single use development. And those concerns have grown even much greater over the past 6 months. What we've seen in other places is basic economics. A single use, single tenant, especially a very large one in a critical piece of real estate, then becomes kind of like all in on black. And what we've seen happen in the last 6 months is companies, no matter how good the tenant is, no matter how great they are, and a lot of them are very great, something goes wrong with the economy and they have to shut down an operation. We've seen cancellation of leases in large single-use buildings, single-tenant buildings all over the country in the past 6 months. We've seen it all over the globe. And what happens with a single-use development with a single tenant and a single industry is you're kind of locked into two things. One is when something goes wrong in that industry or with that particular company, you lose everything. The other thing that happens is you don't have any ability to negotiate as the city with the company. And we've seen, or with the landowner. And we've seen this happen again and again. So I guess just for the record, what I'd like to say is that if there is no legal requirement to let the applicant go with a single use in a single building, it would very much behoove the city to maintain multiple buildings and multiple uses, because it's far better for our economic development, our economic future, than a single building and a single use, regardless of how great the single use may be or how great the single tenant might be. That's all I have.
Thank you very much, Joe. Tech team, if you could bring up Macy Nelson, that would be great. And Macy, same rules apply. When you come up, just unmute yourself, state your name and address or neighborhood for the record, and begin your testimony.
Thank you. Good evening. Macy Nelson. I'm a lawyer for UFCW Local 400, and they've asked me to look at the land use aspects of this proposal. And I have two core points to make. The first is that this project must conform with the purposes of the MXD zone, and that the proposed sketch plan does not satisfy the purposes of the zone. A single use in a single building of 650,000 square feet is inconsistent with the purposes of the zone. If we look together at the zoning ordinance, looking at the purposes of the multi-use, the MXD zone, we see a requirement for multi-use development, and this project is not such a development. So we assert as a legal matter that this sketch plan conflicts with the purposes of the MXD zone. The second core point is the sketch plan conflicts with the purposes of the Gaithersburg master plan. If we look at pages 5, we see a reference to a requirement to diversify the local economy. So the approved development includes a variety of industries. We see at page 9 a requirement that there's a focus on retaining existing businesses. This proposed sketch plan does neither. So for those reasons, on behalf of UFCW Local 400, which I should have said at the outset, has many members in Montgomery County, we recommend disapproval of the sketch plan. Thank you for allowing me to speak on this new system. It worked very well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Macy. Do we have anybody else who'd like to raise their hand? Again, use the Zoom raise hand function or *9 if you're calling in. And we're going once and we're going twice. I do not see anybody raising their hand. I'll tell you what, let me just ask one question to Brian. And I guess this gets to the fundamental question of why we're here, why we need a new sketch plan. Why doesn't the sketch plan that we passed in 2019, why isn't that flexible enough for your needs at this point?
Yeah, so it was our interpretation with the original sketch plan and with the annexation agreement that it did allow for a single use, single building. But after multiple meetings with staff, it was their interpretation that the annexation agreement did not allow for us to develop the property in that manner. So that's why we came back with the revised sketch plan.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, this is Carl Morris. Brian's exactly right. I think when we work with staff, we try to get as much flexibility in that sketch plan as we could, just knowing the market. And as Brian had indicated, we met with John, with Frank, with staff, and you have two parts of this. You have the sketch plan, where if you read the notes in the sketch plan, you're like, okay, you can do what you want. But when you read the resolution that's part of the sketch plan, that's where we get tripped up. So I take full responsibility for really not recognizing what's in the resolution when it talks about multiple buildings and multiple uses. If I knew that that was going to trip us up, we would have spent more time on the resolution defining a single building, single use. But when you look at the sketch plan, it gives you the flexibility. When you look at the resolution, that's where we get tripped up. So what we were trying to do with staff, and this is a workshop, so this is cards on the table, what we would ideally wanted to do is simply amend the resolution that simply states exactly what Phil has stated, our right for a single building, single use. But unfortunately, an amendment for a sketch plan actually time frame wise takes longer than just redoing a sketch plan. So that's why we submitted the revised sketch plan. So
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to open it up one more time. Any question? Rob Wu, please go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. And this is, first off, thank you everyone for the presentation. It was very informative. So I kind of have a legal question, and I'm not sure if now is the right time or after staff presentation, so then I can get Lynn involved as well regarding the meets and bounds of the I3 zone and the E1 zone that's incorporated into the I3 zones.
Good question.
We can let the applicant speak to it if they like, but I'm going to have Lynn wait till after the staff presentation because I know they have some legal elements to discuss there too.
Okay. So I'll save my question. I guess I'm just teeing it up for Brian and Philip that it's coming. So,
well, Brian and Phil, you guys are welcome to take a stab at it if you like.
Let me hear what the staff presentation has to say, and if it touches on the subject, we'll be better informed. So then I'll wait.
Okay. Any questions from the council or planning commission? If not, then we're going to promote whatever staff is waiting to be promoted, and to the applicants, you guys are going to go into the other room where you can see us, and we'll call you up if we have any questions if they come up.
Okay.
And Laura, go ahead, take it away.
Okay, could the tech team bring up packet page 36, please? So now that you've heard from the applicant, staff wanted to give a presentation before we go into further discussion. And during the presentation, I'll briefly go over each topic that was outlined for tonight's discussion, the comments that were provided in your packets from the City Attorney's Office, as well as economic development, and then also go over what staff is seeking guidance on. Next page. So as mentioned by the applicant, the main topics to be discussed this evening are the proposed open and amenity spaces, access and circulation to the site, and the requirements of notes 3, 4, and 5. And then along with that, the terms of the annexation agreement. Next page. As you've seen before, the applicant is proposing a linear park along 355, employee amenity space interior to Block A, and naturalized space at the rear of the property. The staff is supportive of this proposal overall. We do recommend that the linear park along 355 be similar in both size and character to the green space along 355 on the adjacent property, 800 North Frederick. Staff is supportive of maintaining the naturalized space in the rear of the property since it does protect environmentally sensitive areas. And we'd also just like to point out that the green area shown along Montgomery Village or Maryland 124 expands upon existing forest conservation area. Next slide, please. So staff is seeking guidance on the following regarding the open space strategy. Are the mayor and council and planning commission supportive of the locations of the proposed open and amenity areas? And then are you supportive of the proposed character of the open and amenity areas? And what specific changes or elements, if there are any, would you want to see incorporated? So at this point, staff would be happy to pause and allow the council and commission to discuss this topic or these questions, or I can continue and we can wait to do discussion at the end.
We might as well pause and go through some of these. It makes sense the way this presentation is laid out. But I feel like, and maybe council members might disagree, but I feel like in terms of where the amenities area are, where, the locations, I just feel like this may be a question better suited to the planning commission, because this is sort of the area you guys live in and operate in. I wanted to give John Bauer an opportunity to weigh in on this if he'd like.
Well, I'll at least start this good discussion. Laura, when you, and I forget the word you just used exactly, but the nature or the character of the amenity space, it's really just a sketch plan. So it's really hard to know too much more than there just happens to be a green swath up close to the street, the public road, which conceptually seems like a good idea because then it's accessible, as opposed to, I think some early plans had it down buried in the site, which would make it less of a public amenity, or at least less accessible or less obviously accessible as a public amenity. So like in that respect, what I'd be curious to know though is, as you look at this relative to some of the other development that's happened north of here, as a general dimension, from the street back, is it consistent with the amount of green space buffering and public amenity we're seeing on some of the other projects?
I think I will let Rob go into that a little more.
I knew that was coming. Yes, in many ways. If you look at the FedEx development, some of their more open, they have a linear park that's a certain depth. Then in the rear, obviously they provide there's that pond back there. So they also provide, environmentally sensitive areas. Then sprinkled throughout, partially used as forest con, was smaller parks with bench seating that were under Category 2 easements. Monument really at this stage doesn't really have much in that relationship. They're more, fully paved, and I think there's still 1 or 2 open pad sites still to be done. So if we went to some other developments that may be similar, maybe at a larger scale, if you look at AstraZeneca, down closer to the Kentlands, they have similar situations like this, because again, sometimes there's the security measures, so they want to have public amenity open spaces closer to the public access, so there's still the security aspect for certain uses.
Right. I think for the purposes of this plan, what seems to be true, there's good continuity between what's proposed in this plan and what's already established moving north, which means if the public wanted to use the space, they've got a nice natural connectivity, access, all of that begins to kind of work together, as opposed to ducking in and out of different properties or having to kind of run an obstacle course to find the different outdoor amenities. That's a fair way to paraphrase it.
Any other questions or comments? If not, we could just we can move forward with Laura's presentation. Go ahead, Laura.
Okay, so I think, so next slide, please. Yes, so the applicant has submitted a revised circulation pattern. The changes include moving the parallel road out of the linear park and clarifying the direction of the egress points. Drive aisle potential locations are shown, but as this is a sketch plan and we don't have building envelopes, we cannot know the specific locations of those, so that will come in SDP. So the only comment staff has here is that we are supportive of what the applicant has done, shifting that parallel road out of the linear park. The next page. So staff here is looking for guidance on the following. Are the mayor and council and planning commission supportive of the overall circulation pattern shown, including the multiple access points from North Frederick Avenue? And then given the limitations in sketch plan design, the fact that it's supposed to be more flexible versus detailed, are there any specific changes or elements that you would want to see incorporated? And again, I can pause here for discussion.
Thank you, Laura. Personally, for me, it's the access to North Frederick Avenue. The multiple access point seems fine. I'd be interested to hear what the Planning Commission has to say about on this point. Not being a professional planner, but looking at this plan, the internal flow seems to be very supportive of a single building with a single use. It's sort of all around one central point instead of points flowing through. So I just note that as that wasn't the intent of the council before, to have a single building with a single use. Obviously that's part of the decision that's before us. John, should I turn it over to you for any comments from the Planning Commission, or I don't see you raising your hand on this, but I'm putting you on the spot.
Well, look for some other hands if like I don't see any either. It's a quiet crowd tonight. That was the number one most obvious change to me from the former approved sketch plan to the revised, which is it was really a gesture going from an internal circulation route that clearly created an active internal site by inviting public transportation or public transportation of any kind onto the site, as opposed to accessing it at a very controlled point and staying kind of to the perimeter of it, and then something else happening to the interior of the site. And I think we talked about that at the last meeting, that immediately makes very suspicious whether it's an active site or not, or something that's just completely cordoned off from the public and something else is happening. And that clearly is counter to where we'd want to see something in the MXD zone. However, it's not necessarily counter to what the I3 zone would at least allow. It may not be ideal, but it would be at least consistent with that. So it's a little bit of a reconciliation I'm having trouble with, because as I read through the I3 zone, it then references, I'm going to get this backwards so I don't read it while I say it. The I3 zone references the E1 zone approved uses, and they bounce back and forth between things like what's approved for internal truck parking and some of the activities and some of the traffic, between what appears to be a very public kind of site development plan and what is a more private or more internalized, sort of introverted site development plan. And I think we're going to get caught in that discussion here very shortly about, if we're going through an MXD process to look at the plan, then we should be able to overlay some criteria about the planning and the configuration of the site, while the I3 zone permitted uses would inform what can happen on the site, but it wouldn't necessarily dictate how it's laid out and how we envision a diversity of uses or diversity of tenants or whatever that might be.
Anyone else want to weigh in? Thank you, John. Lorianne, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. So I had a question to follow up on what John just said. How do we reconcile the two? If we're using the I3 zone, but making considerations about what would be proposed in an MXD zone, I guess how do we assess the feasibility of a single building with a single use as being the highest and best use for this particular site.
Lynn, is this where you want to jump in?
Sorry, let me unmute. Sure, I certainly will. No, I do agree with much of what the applicant said during their presentation with regard to the history of this property and what the annexation agreement provides and the different zones provide. However, it is clear that the property is zoned MXD, which they've readily admitted requires the MXD processes to be met through the approval process. Those do contain certain criteria that have to be met for this particular plan. They also admitted that there is no language in the I3 zone itself that provides for or states that only that a single building, single use can be used. And I know that in Frank Johnson's memo, he addressed many of these issues. The language in the I3 zone does talk about buildings and uses, both singularly and plurally. And as I pointed out in section 24-1 of the city zoning ordinance, that it does allow singular to be used, both as singular and plural. But given all of those factors, I think we have a fundamental disagreement with counsel for the applicant as to whether they have a by right use for a single building and with a single use. To me, that seems much more of an SDP issue. Staff did take a look at many of the sketch plans and site plans that we have for other I3 uses in the city. None of them specifically say single building, single use, or even multiple buildings, multiple uses. And that's something that's usually developed further on in the planning process through the SDP and final site plan process. The sketch plan is supposed to be more of a bubble plan, a general guidance as to what's going to occur on the site, not to set out specific uses. And it does, again, potentially limit uses on the property itself. So I think that that's kind of the fundamental disagreement from the legal perspective between staff and the applicant's position. But staff can really find no specific requirement that gives them a by right use to a single building, single use in the I3 zone, regardless of whether you look at the MXD zone. Also, I think when you look at the annexation agreement itself, and Phil Hummel did read the exact language out of the agreement, which I appreciate because they've not used the exact language out of the agreement in their notes on the plan in their note 9. They used their interpretation of what is said in the annexation agreement. But the annexation agreement does certainly provide that any future development on the property does have to be in compliance with the I3 zone and applicable government codes and regulations, and such requirements thereafter may be modified by the terms and conditions of this agreement. So they are bound not only by the criteria of the I3 zone, but other applicable governmental codes and regulations. And certainly here, because the property was annexed or was rezoned to the MXD zone, and they have readily admitted that they do have to comply with the MXD requirements for the processing of this. So it is a little bit confusing. It's not a clear, I can't say, you have to look at this specific section of the MXD zone and this specific exception of the I3. Those are areas that are subject to interpretation. But I think that in making the decision, you have to clearly look at the criteria in the MXD zone. Certainly we're at the sketch plan stage, so we have to look at the 3 criteria for the sketch plan. If this goes to, if we get to the SDP stage, there are additional criteria there that do deal with some of these other issues that have been discussed this evening.
Now, Lori, and I don't know if you have follow-ups, but I saw Rob Wu sort of chomping at the bit with a follow-up to Lynn. So go ahead, Rob and Lori, and we'll come back to you if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the conversation because this is kind of where my question was going. I'm glad Lynn jumped in there. The lawyer in me, I went and read the zoning code. And in looking at the I3 zone, I note Amazon's in the room. I think any city would be happy to have Amazon in the room, but at this stage, at the sketch plan stage, I don't care if it's Amazon or Microsoft or Oracle or whoever the case may be, because it's not really an appropriate consideration right now. And so in looking at the I3 zone, you've got 24-142, which really sets the standard for the zone. And I don't see anything in that standard for the zone that would say 1 building, 2 buildings, 8 buildings, a billion buildings. It really sets off apart this overarching standard for the use of the property. And so when we're talking about 1 building versus 2 buildings or placement acreage here or there, that sounds like an SDP issue here. So that's kind of, I think we're all facing the same consternation here with the applicant's proposed amendments to the sketch plan, because they're really it really seems to constrain the sketch plan in a way that I think is appropriate considerations for the SDP stage. I don't know how we reconcile that.
Was that a question, Elaine?
I say if it was, I concur. And I mean, that was one of the reasons why we did, try to take a look at some other sketch plans and also site plans and SDPs, in the I3 zone, and none of them contain a similar note to what's proposed in note 3.
I see Ryan's hand. John, were you raising your hand before? Or were you just moving around, John Bauer? Okay, Ryan, go ahead.
A follow-up question to Councilmember Wu. If we were to find at the SDP stage under the MXD zone that it met all of the other criteria required by the MXD zone, could we determine to approve a single building for a single use at the SDP phase under the MXD zone?
Was that a question for me or for Rob?
That's for you, Lynn. I was just sort of following up on Rob's point about whether these are sort of more issues for the SDP phase, and asking a sort of more specific question about what's allowable at the SDP phase. There are assumptions in my question, obviously, and I'm not saying that we've made any of those determinations yet. But if we had, is there anything that would prohibit us from making a determination at the SDP phase to approve a single building for a single use?
I don't believe that it would. I mean, I know that there are in the MXD zone, it does talk about, a mix of uses and mix of buildings. But again, because the underlying zoning via the annexation agreement is the I3 use, I think that we would have that ability at the SDP stage.
Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. So I think this has been quite an academic discussion, but I think there's an overlay here that we have to consider, and that's our master plan for this part of the city in this region. And it has to do with, realizing the potential of various properties in the city and how they fit and how they're compatible with other adjacent properties and in our plans for the entire corridor there. So I guess my question is, why is the ability to develop, at this phase, to propose a development for single use in a single building, the highest and best use for this particular property, given all of the other things we've talked about in terms of the prominent location, the accessibility, the gateway to the city, and the master plan for the area, how that makes sense. It doesn't seem like a single use, single building would be such, would help us realize the potential. And also, I think it begs the question of resiliency that we had one speaker, one commenter from the public that talked about that particular issue, that with all the eggs in one basket, that creates some opportunity, but also creates some significant risks that we've seen happen recently. So I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that, but perhaps somebody from the Planning Commission or staff wants to talk about, is this actually the single highest and best use of this particular site?
What I would ask, Councilmember Sesma, could we get to the discussions of note 3, 4, and 5? Because I think that's more appropriate. everything you're saying, needs to be discussed. I think it just works better with those notes as opposed to circulation right now.
Well,
that's all right.
I have a comment about the circulation though, too, then.
All right, so give us your comment on circulation, then let's move
Okay.
forward to the presentation.
So when we looked at the location of the linear park and the employee amenities, it seemed that, I know this is just a sketch plan, but the particular location more or less dictates the circulation in the property, given its location. So that seems to force us to think about what the circulation would actually be given the location of that amenity. Parallel to the linear park, parallel to 355, et cetera, and basically creates an obstacle once you enter the property from the southernmost entry and exit. It more or less forces, you can't see it because, I mean, there's nothing there, right? Other than this is the location of the amenity. So it more or less forces circulation to go a certain way in the way it's laid out. So that's my comment about that. It combines the issue of the employee amenity and circulation and road.
Thank you, Mike. Let's send it back to Laura and go ahead and continue with the presentation.
Okay, so if tech team could bring back up page 42. Yes, okay. So notes 3, 4, and 5 deal with buildings, uses, floor area percentages, as well as blocks and phasing. So while discussing these individually, I just wanted to point out that they are linked, especially notes 3 and 4. And so guidance on one note may require specific actions on another note. Next page. So note 3 implies that the property may be developed with multiple buildings and uses, single buildings with single uses, or solely with a single use in a single building. So staff wants to point out a couple things in relation to this note. One, use does not necessarily mean user. So a single use building may contain multiple users or tenants, such as the case with a multi-tenant office building. Also, mixed use refers to uses of independent utility and not typical accessory uses, such as a gym in an office building that's only open to the tenant's employees. That would still be considered a single use office building. And then lastly, as you have heard from the applicant, they have stated that the annexation agreement affords them the right to develop the property solely with a single use building. Next page. So legal and economic development have offered some comments on this note. I know we've already kind of discussed it, but as you saw in your packets, the memo from the city attorney's office determined that neither MXD nor the I3 zone specify that a single use is permitted in a single building by right. So the allowance in the annexation agreement to develop in compliance with the I3 zone does not explicitly grant by right development of solely a single use building on the site. It could be done, but it would be at the discretion of council. Economic development's position here is that the note should require 2 or more buildings, as mixed use development is lower risk and supports things like sustained occupancy, job creation, and property value over the long term. Next page. So staff is looking for guidance on the following. Are the mayor and council and planning commission supportive of single uses in single buildings, or conversely requiring a mix of uses in any building? And staff notes that precluding all single use buildings on site would deny developments such as a restaurant pad site or a multi-tenant office building. And then, are the mayor and council and planning commission supportive of developing the entire site solely with a single building, single use? So no other buildings or uses on site, just one single use building. And staff notes that should this be supported, then allowing 100% of a use category under note 4 is required. And I'll explain more why that is when I get into note 4. And with that in mind, I think it would be best if I just keep going through all the notes and then we can do discussion after I get through each one. So next page, please. So note 4 proposes modified maximum floor area percentages on the sketch plan. As you heard, the applicant's proposing up to 10% retail commercial uses, up to 100% employment and office, and up to 100% other commercial or institutional. As you heard, the applicant has provided arguments for these modified percentages. They've provided these arguments because they differ from what is allowed in the MXD zone, which you'll see on the next slide. You could go to the next slide. So the MXD zone allows up to 60% retail commercial uses, up to 65% employment and office, and up to 15% other commercial institutional. But the code does state that these can be exceeded for good cause shown. Next page. Here are the points staff wanted to bring up regarding note 4. As discussed, notes 3 and 4 are connected. Note 3, as proposed, allows the applicant to develop solely with a single use, which could only be achieved if at least one of these use categories allows up to 100% floor area. So if the property were developed solely with a single building and none of these categories allow up to 100% floor area, then that building must include multiple different uses. Also wanted to point out these percentages can be applied in one of two ways. They can be based on total allowable square footage proposed on the sketch plan, or based on the square footage actually submitted at SDP. So to give an example, if they're based on total allowable square footage, that would mean that for this sketch plan, 10% retail, which is what the applicant is proposing, would permit 65,000 square feet of retail, regardless of what comes in at SDP. So if a plan is submitted for the entire site showing only 100,000 square feet of development total at SDP, they would still be allowed to build up to 65,000 square feet of retail. On the other hand, if they're based on square footage submitted at SDP, then that would only permit 10,000 square feet of retail, or 10% of the 100,000 square feet actually submitted. Next page. Economic Development has offered the following comments on note 4. 1, the Frederick Avenue corridor is targeted for reinvestment, and allowing any one use category to be up to 100% can eliminate a mix of uses and does not assure redevelopment in a manner that really advances the corridor. But staff does agree that the current code limit of 15% on other commercial or institutional uses could impede job creation. They also hold the position that the application of use category percentages at sketch plan stage means that they're based upon a total building area that might never occur. And so Economic Development recommends deleting the references to the specific square footages here and require that these be determined at SDP. And then if the property's impact on the surrounding area isn't objective, then Economic Development recommends that the following percentage caps be adhered to ensure that the property redevelops to a higher standard. So you'll see they're proposing up to 10% retail commercial, which is what the applicant's proposing, up to 65% employment or office, which matches the code, and then increasing other commercial and institutional to 65%, as opposed to the 15% currently allowed per code. Next page. So in terms of guidance for this note, there really are 4 options. Support the percentage caps as proposed by the applicant, support those proposed by Economic Development, stick to what is allowed in the code, or propose and demonstrate good cause for new percentages. And staff is also looking for guidance on how to apply the percentages. Should they be based on the total allowable square footage at sketch, which is 650,000 square feet, or based on what is actually submitted at SDP. Next slide. The applicant has proposed a revised note 5, adding an additional sentence at the end. This note implies that of the 2 separate phases or blocks shown on the sketch plan, only 15% of the density on one block can be shifted to the other. However, it also allows the property to be developed in a single phase or block, thus nullifying the density shift. So staff wants to point out that the blocks and phases shown on the sketch plan are not subdivision. Those are done in SDP, so these are just relative locations. And I also wanted to point out that if there is support for developing the site solely with a single building, then note 5 should be supported to allow a single block, as typically the single buildings would be done in one block and one phase. Next page. Economic Development supports having appropriate blocks and limiting the shifting of density between them to encourage higher density development overall. as maximizing building size relative to parcel size helps promote continued smart growth of the city. They also view this site as a gateway to the eastern side of the city that can be used to set the standard for and help to revitalize the surrounding area. Next slide. So for this note, staff is asking, do the Mayor, Council, and Planning Commission support the development of the property as one single phase or block? And if not, would you support the proposed shifting of densities between the blocks? So that's all staff has. If you want to discuss more of the 3 notes or anything else.
Thank you so much, Laura, for the presentation. You know, I'll speak for me here. You know, I supported the previous sketch plan in 2019. I support the concept of mixed use here, and I think to ensure an effective mix of uses, we basically all these questions are similar in that they're asking us to determine or interpret our code or interpret our intent as to whether we're looking to ensure a mix of uses, which would not allow shifting of the entire density between blocks, and it would be supportive of required percentages of different uses, and it would not be supportive of a single building, single use. These are all sort of different forms of the same general question on direction, and that's, you know, I'm kind of partial to the way we have it zoned now as a mixed use zone, and so I'd be interested to hear what anybody else has to say, and I'll, as I call for people to raise hands for questions and comments, I'll note that the applicant is here and available for questions, and we can bring them up here for questions at your request. So who would like to go next on offering guidance here? Lorianne Sale.
Thank you, Mayor. So I would agree with you. I think when Laura mentioned, you know, if this was a project that was, you know, another mall or another retail space, this could potentially just become another 100% retail commercial lot. And in thinking about the highest and best use of this corner, I think the floor that our economic development and planning department have recommended are reasonable for mixed use development. And given the clarification from staff that, you know, this is a mixed use zone, I would agree that this doesn't seem like the highest and best use project. And it's, I would say, drastically different from the plans that we reviewed in 2019. That's all for now.
Thank you, Lorianne. Who'd like to go next? I know somebody has an opinion here. Mike Sesma.
Thank you. I guess I'll just express my continuing high level of enthusiasm of the sketch plan that we approved in 2019. I think it does take advantage and has the greatest potential for the highest and best use of this particular property. I think it aligns well. That plan aligned well with our master plan, with our plans for the corridor, and with compatibility for the adjacent properties. So. And this region of the city. So that's where I sit, which means it's quite different than what we're looking at tonight.
Rob Wu.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. You know, I too support the consideration we gave for this site previously, and the sketch plan that was adopted. You know, and primarily that conversation was informed by a lot of the information that the applicant was giving with respect to the economic conditions at that time and what they saw as the best uses for the site. You know, looking back even, I would go probably in a step of more towards the traditional MXD zoning requirements. So, you know, I think in our consideration of the past sketch plan, we gave the applicant more leeway from the MX, what we consider the traditional mixes for MXD zone because of what was being presented at that time. You know, this is a high visibility marquee site. I think that's what we considered at the time. But, you know, given the passage of time, I'm fine with the current sketch plan consideration that was given. But if we were to relook it, I would probably be in favor of leaning more towards the ratios that are found in the MXD zone itself.
Thank you, Rob. Who'd like to go next? Planning Commission, feel free to jump in. Ryan Spiegel, go right ahead.
Yeah, I mean, from a process issue perspective, I don't think we ought to be doing anything that prevents or preempts or handcuffs our decision-making process. That was why I sort of asked that question earlier on tonight. You know, if some of these issues that the applicant wants to sort of lock in these various notes and other potential changes to the sketch plan prevent us from being able to do the full scope of things that we want to consider doing at the SDP phase, then I'm queasy about the idea of locking ourselves in beyond what we need to do. And the whole point of this process, as laid out in our law, is to give us the flexibility under the framework of an MXD zone, even if that includes incorporating some aspects of the I3 zone in light of the annexation agreement, using that framework and going through the process at the SDP phase to make determinations about some of these more specific questions of the plan. And I'm just uncomfortable with the idea of making those decisions sort of too early in the process at this point and locking in the sketch plan too rigidly on some of these issues. And so for me, it's more of a process question. And I guess I go back to that earlier question I asked and want to clarify, if we were to stick with the approved sketch plan from 2019, is there any language in there that would essentially prevent us from having full flexibility at the SDP phase? Is there anything in there that would say, if we suddenly decided at the SDP phase that we wanted to approve a single building with a single use as long as it met all the other criteria, that the same way that I don't want a new sketch plan to prevent us from doing what we might be able to do, I don't necessarily want the existing sketch plan to prevent us from being able to do what we want to do with the SDP phase. I don't think it does, but I guess I'm just getting a little, trying to get a little clarification about that.
The crux of the matter with the previous sketch plan and why we're back here this evening, as Carl Morris mentioned, was the previous one with the resolution required multiple buildings. So you could do a single use, but it had to be in multiple buildings. So the crux of note 3 that we're asking now, you know, as presented, you know, they allow single building, single use, multi-building, single use, multi-buildings, but you can develop the site. The crux that we're trying to seek guidance on is, at this stage, does the council support the site solely being developed with a single use in a single building? Councilmember Spiegel, what I'm gathering from you is, you know, we should leave the note as is and potentially have that fight at SDP based upon the findings of SDP. Whereas I've heard from Councilmember Sales and Councilmember Sesma that they don't necessarily support that, and, you know, at the sketch they want to do the requirements. So then it's the trickle down, and, you know, if staff can get some, you know, consensus guidance from council about which way they go, that may help frame some of these other discussions. Because again, as you mentioned, if council's going to support solely developing the site with a single building, single use, that resolves all of our questions in note 4, because you must allow 100% of something. The only question comes in, you know, essentially, is how do you apply?
Yeah,
things.
but the difference, Rob, if I might, is whether this question is about whether a single use in a single building is by right, or even if it's not by right, it's locked in by an amended sketch plan, or whether we have the flexibility to consider it or not consider it at SDP in our discretion, versus the separate question of whether or not the current approved sketch plan actually prevents us from considering a single building, single use. And I think what I'm hearing is, reading the resolution the way we're reading it, it may technically prevent us, although multiple buildings can come, I'm sure, in all sorts of forms, large and small. So, I mean, I guess that's a bridge we could cross at the SDP phase.
John Bauer, go right ahead. John, you're muted.
I'm not now.
All right.
I wanted to wade into where Ryan just left off with the multiple building question. Assuming that, so there's three components: the use, the user, and the number of buildings. If we focus on just the number of buildings as the one kind of central issue for the moment, is there any real technical definition of a single versus a multiple building? Because I want to be careful that we don't all operate on a preconceived notion of what a single building is, to the detriment of either the applicant or the detriment of what we could potentially get on a project like this. So, for example, if your mind immediately jumps to a tilt-up concrete warehouse, that's certainly a single building and probably not what any of us would want to see on the site. However, you could imagine a series or a building that's well integrating a bunch of different zones that really essentially behaves and performs like a single building, but to all those from the outside looks like a complex of buildings or an interconnected set of buildings. Again, I don't want to set up a preconceived notion. I just want to establish there's a range of ways this might actually play out in real life. And my question really for Rob is there any reason to assume that any language about the number of buildings has any kind of technical limitation to it in and of itself, or if it really becomes a judgment call at SDP?
Unless, the guidance that comes out of here where we craft a condition that amends note 3 to say, that specifically precludes a single building, single use as the sole development on the site, then everything else would go to SDP. And Chairman Bauer, to your point, I mean, it was brought up in the applicant's comment, about FedEx. Well, if you look next door to FedEx, it's a single use, but technically there's two buildings on that site. There's a 4,000 square foot gateway building that is separated by 50 feet from the primary. So that is a single use multi-building. So again, this is why, we're asking council and the planning commission for direction on this. Again, I think the real crux of this all note 3 is, do you support or not support solely developing, regardless of use, regardless of user, one use, one building for all 44 acres?
Yeah, I think the way I want to propose addressing this is it's not so much single use, single user, single building. It's how purpose-built the buildings are. So if you imagine, like, I'll pick a building out of the blue in the city of Gaithersburg that's going through a pretty substantial renovation right now because it essentially was obsolete based on technology and the requirements of technology 40 years ago when it was built. For it to be adaptable to another business, it was a fundamental gutting of the building and reconfiguring it for it to be usable. On the other hand, you could imagine a building type that could move forward on this site that would have the flexibility of housing any number of tenants, even if it was a single use or a single type of build or type of use. It would have the flexibility of accommodating future growth or the evolution of business on the site or of activity on the site, or be subdividable if more than one tenant showed up and wanted to use the building in the future. Things like that seem to be more important to the discussion than just the bumper sticker term single use, single building. I mean, that makes me nervous because I don't think there's enough information there to make a call. It's a broader definition, and it's a broader description that I think we need to be addressing.
I think, just to help frame this, I think if Sharon could come in, from the economic development perspective, discussing this. I mean, in short, staff, as we sort of mentioned, doesn't have a problem with single building, single use. It's the solely category. If somebody wanted to build two buildings on this site and, one of them is 100% office, we don't have an issue with that. We've seen trying to shoehorn in mixed uses in every single building isn't always successful and really doesn't reflect the market. But, I'd like to have Sharon weigh in.
Yeah, I think what we're more interested in is the overall development of the property with a mix of uses. and a building could be built for one function, have multiple tenants over time. So that may be something we just want to leave for SDP. We were more concerned about assurance of mixed use.
So perhaps if the big concern is mixed uses, we could focus more on the percentage caps as opposed to the specific number of buildings. I don't know if that would be, if that offers a better solution.
Well, as we think about that, I saw Mike's hand go up and then Lorianne. So we'll go to Mike and then Lorianne.
Well, I already expressed my enthusiasm for the SDP that we passed last year. I'm sorry, the sketch plan that we passed last year, approved. And I remember the illustrations and schematics and renderings that the applicant showed us at that time that addressed this whole thing about the issue of a building type and how flexible their style of building was. And they showed us numerous projects throughout the region that they built. These are basically tilt-up concrete buildings of various sizes. And, you know, I think one of the things they emphasized when they argued for how their sketch was compatible with the MXD zone, that they had the ultimate flexibility in the design of their multiple buildings that they were going to put on the site. So I was pretty convinced that they would be able to provide the flexibility, whether it was going to be a single use in a single building with multiple buildings, or whether there's going to be a multiple use in a single building with multiple buildings. I was satisfied that they would be able to do that and then meet the percentages of the zone that we already require and expect. So to get to Laura's question, I don't have any problem with the percentages that we've already talked about that staff has recommended that are included in the MXD zone. So I think that provides some options both to the applicant and and as we go forward looking at SDP.
Can I jump in with a quick question, Mike, if you wouldn't mind? So would you then recommend a percentage but no actual hard square footage cap?
Well, I mean, there's a cap on the overall property, but oh, you mean in terms of what they're proposing at various times, or?
Yeah, I mean, whatever it might be, it could be. I mean, that's the flexibility you all have with an SDP or with an MXD zone, is you could make those numbers go anywhere you wanted, but the percentage could be the thing that drives.
Sure, I guess so the concern then would be the phasing, and if it was all built in one phase, that wouldn't be a problem. But if it's phased, and then, you know, phase one is completed and phase two never gets built. So I think we have to be very careful there in terms of what we want and what we get. So if if we base it on total, the percentages of the total square footage allowed, rather than on what's proposed at the time of SDP, then I think we have to be careful there. So does that answer your question, John? Okay, thanks.
Let's go to Lorianne.
Thank you, Mayor. Since Sharon and Tom are here, I was wondering if this sketch plan has been brought before our Economic Development Committee. I believe they weighed in on the original plan, but have they provided any feedback?
We have not taken this sketch plan to the Economic Development Committee.
Primarily,
has the committee met? Has it been meeting during COVID?
You know, that was the principal issue. We did not meet during the spring and had a June meeting. So it was not, we were not able to put it before them.
That makes sense. John Schlichting.
Yes, I just wanted to kind of try to refocus the conversation because, I mean, the reason why we're here tonight is because the applicant applied for an SDP that was a single use in a single building. And what staff determined prior to it coming back to the council and the planning commission was that it did not comply with the sketch plan. So that's why we're here with a new sketch plan So really the focus of this discussion tonight is whether or not you all are comfortable with a single use in a single building. It's pretty simple.
Solely.
We haven't heard from Neil Harris tonight. So I might go ahead and put him on the spot.
Well, I've been enjoying this riveting discussion, especially all the legal talk. I always find that fascinating. But you know, my real question revolves around and I'm not sure it's appropriate at this stage of the discussion, which is why I've been keeping quiet. Which is, it's a 44-acre site at the most highly trafficked intersection in the city, even before the Watkins Mill interchange came in. So looking for the highest best use, and I expected to see something with greater density. That one building on a 44-acre site, and not a 20-story building or anything like that, just doesn't seem like the optimal use for this site. But again, I'm not sure that that's an appropriate discussion to have at the sketch plan phase, so that's why I haven't really brought it up yet. So if it's appropriate, I'm happy to share that feedback. But
well, but you could take that and apply it to the question at hand. You can, I think, sort of extrapolate that you prefer not a single use and a single user in a single building.
Or a bigger one, but Lynn?
Go ahead, Lynn.
Yeah, I mean, really, you need to look at the criteria for approval of the sketch plan, and one of them is whether it complies with the master plan. I think that there's been some discussion this evening that there are some criteria in the master plan to promote economic development and the highest and best uses of property. So I mean, that would tie into whether you can find that this particular sketch plan does comply with the master plan.
Well, and that's a great point. And I actually was looking through the various iterations of the master plan during the course of this discussion for that very reason. And yes, I think at the end of the day, from an economic development point of view, the highest and best use of the property appears to be something much more ambitious than what we're seeing here today. So that's why I'm really not very comfortable with the current sketch plan.
So Rob Robinson, if this conversation was to end right here, right now, do you feel guided?
No. It seems as if council is a bit split. Well, in the sense of the substantive issue with Note 3, keep Note 3 as is, or preclude solely developing with a single building, single use, because some of the discussion has gone, allow that flexibility, but have that argument at SDP.
Yeah, I think that was Ryan's point. Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah, so in follow-up to that, and didn't mean to throw a wrench in the conversation, but there could be an amendment to the sketch plan that addresses that one single bit of language in the resolution that was already passed without necessarily making all these other changes that have been suggested on these other issues regarding, you know, by right or other incorporation of language that we've been going over tonight, right? I mean, you could have a sort of a compromise result where you're not necessarily agreeing to amend the sketch plan to include all these other things, but you could amend simply the resolution that included the language requiring there to be more than one building. I don't know if that's a question for Rob or a question for Lynn.
Let's go to Lynn first.
So I think what you're proposing is an amendment of the 2019 sketch plan, which would be a completely different process than what we're in now. I mean, we'd have to undertake that as a separate process. I mean, right now we have an application for a new sketch plan. So, you know, we have to, I mean, unless the applicant, you know, voluntarily withdraws that plan, we have to make a decision with regard to that plan. I mean, certainly it can be amended as the current proposed can be amended through the process. But I think that the resolution that is of concern was with the approval of the 2019 sketch plan.
Okay.
Okay, so given what's before us, Ryan, you know, what guidance would you offer to Rob?
Am I the swing vote?
Well, I'm not saying that you are, but I just want some clarity so we can move forward here.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've made my position clear. I'm just not sure procedurally how to get there. So I am uncomfortable approving several pieces of language proposed by the current proposed sketch plan, because I think that they unnecessarily tie our hands at SDP phase. So I don't know if there's a way to amend the current proposed plan so that we essentially strip out a lot of that language and are left with a result kind of along the lines of what I was just suggesting that Lynn seemed to indicate would require a completely new process. But if there were, I guess I would be open to that. If there isn't, then I guess I would be more comfortable sticking with what we have already approved and seeing if we can work within that framework to remain flexible at the SDP phase.
Okay, Lorianne, I saw your hand, and then I saw Rob Wu.
So just to follow up on Rob's point and to stay focused about the note 3 about the uses and the single use, I don't mind a building having multi-uses, but to narrow the scope to only allow a plan to move forward with a single solely used sole use, it just doesn't seem like the most appropriate designation for this particular site. I just cannot disagree more that it doesn't seem adequate. And do you feel guided?
Do you look at you? Rob, that's clear guidance from Lorianne, correct?
Yeah, so again, council, what I'm understanding, and planning commission's more than welcome to weigh in also, it's clear to me council members Sales and Sesma, want to preclude one building, one use on 44 acres in simplicity terms, which, that's something we can amend note. Again, my question comes, council members Wu, Harris, and Spiegel, I want to make sure, that if there's a third that supports that, that's sort of the guidance received, but working under the construct of the application in front of us.
I think Neil gave you that guidance, but I'm gonna go to Councilmember Wu.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I'm not sure if, Rob, let me know if this guides you or not, because it's not as clear cut as perhaps I usually am. I'm kind of in the same boat as Ryan is that, in looking at the zoning ordinances that are applicable to the site, as well as the annexation agreement, I'm not necessarily in the same camp as the applicant's attorneys as to the rights that are afforded to them under the legal framework. And therefore, I don't think I would be in the position of applying the rights that the applicant believes it's afforded under the legal framework to the sketch plan itself. I think with even under the I3 zone, if this was a straight I3 zone, Euclidean consideration, I don't think there's a by right one building, one user, one use, one user, one building in the I3 zone. And now you've got the added complication of applying MXD procedures to the applicant. And so I don't agree that this is a by right type consideration that we have to accede to the applicant's consideration with respect to that use, and therefore I don't agree in applying those uses or incorporating them into the sketch plan. I would want the flexibility though to have considerations. As I said before, we're not considering Amazon here because we're considering land use here, but they've kind of crept into the consideration. So I would like to have that type of flexibility afforded to me at later stages is in the process to be able to take those things into consideration. But I don't think it's appropriate now. Guided, is that kind of?
Yes, I think it really comes down to Councilmember Harris.
I mean, I could also throw in there, you know, where my mind is in considering where this property is located within the city. I don't think it's what we're looking for the future is kind of the 1970s type model of large scale surface parking in one building there. I mean, but I want the discretion to be able to look at those things under perhaps the STP.
Go ahead, Neil.
I was going to give you my proxy, Judd, but I guess I have to do it myself. I think I will come down along with my colleagues who think that a single building and a single use and a single building on this property is not appropriate.
Thank you. So you feel guided at this point, Rob?
Yeah, so just to be clear, once again, you know, a note 3 will probably craft a condition that while it may accommodate a single building, single use, the site is not to be developed solely with one building and one use.
That sounds good. Anything more from the Planning Commission on this? Not to, Lloyd, go ahead.
I would cast my vote with Councilman Harris and the majority so far from what I understand. I too believe that single use, single building is not appropriate for the site, but I'm willing to and be flexible enough to listen to more as this proceeds through the process. I think at this point, I think what Chairman Bauer said about definitions of how we would say single use or single building, I think is still up for debate. And I'd like to be able to flesh that out a little bit more in the future as well.
Thank you.
If I may, based upon what was just decided, if IT, if you could take us back to page 38. I'd like to quickly revisit the discussion about circulation because I think this now lends context. If the decision is not to develop the site solely with a single building, single use, this overview, the arrows coming in off the parallel street, one of them aligns with, you know, the proposed separation of blocks, and the other one show, you know, entrance into these areas. So if we know essentially, you know, does that, you know, now that we've resolved note 3, does that lend more understanding to this discussion, what we were seeking guidance on? You know, again, this is an opportunity. I think it lends more context. So you're showing how stuff will go in, you know, if we want to quickly revisit, you know, if you wanted to have a discussion, things you could do for setting up at the SDP stages, you know, you don't just want, you know, drive aisles and surface parking lots to Councilmember Wu's discussion, you know, you'd want some of these to be more of a formalized road to be shown at preliminary subdivision or something along those lines. Again, I'm just trying to tie up the loose ends. So with 3 being resolved, everything now begins to fall into place. Chairman Bauer, I mean, does this sort of answer some of your questions, you know, that you had brought up?
It does. And I'll go back to 2 points I made earlier. If we go at a policy level, never mind the design piece, but if at policy level, Mayor and Council are moving toward direction that it is not a single building, single user, maybe single uses, but whatever that ends up being, then the implication would be a circulation pattern more like the original sketch plan, which got circulation into the site in a public way. It wasn't assumed that they basically crossed the line and then somehow internally there was circulation either through parking lots or whatever it might be. And so I would expect that if the idea is that the site will be developed with a multi-building concept, the circulation would represent that in some way or form. To your point, Rob, if it's 2 buildings, if it's 4 buildings, I don't know what the right answer is. That would be clearly an SDP notion, because I think, again, we're getting a little too deep at sketch plan to even suggest that there's 3 access points to the site shown. I mean, that's actually plenty. You know, you could do a lot with that. And whether or not somebody shows an arrow that goes all the way into the middle of the site or goes around to one side and then enters from a different direction, I'm not sure that matters at this stage. But the implication would be, if it's not a single user, single building scheme, then there would likely be other sort of discrete access points for the other users. So.
That's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure I see Councilmember Wu.
Councilmember Wu.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Rob, I was going to respond when you called on me, but I had to wait for the mayor to do so. Proceed. I kind of just have a procedural question of where we are right now. The applicant has submitted a new sketch plan. I think from what we're hearing here, there's not consensus in support of some of the amendments that are being proposed by the applicant. And so therefore, are we going to then at a later date vote on that sketch plan, or are you going to go back to the applicant to try to work out amendment to the existing sketch plan? Or I would like some guidance on where we are and where we're going.
Procedurally, part of the reason for this work session is we're reviewing the sketch plan as submitted, but council has the right to put conditions. So this isn't, we're not asking council and planning commission with their recommendation to do a binary thumbs up, thumbs down. The purpose for this is exploring, what are things with the notes that potentially could be conditioned and amended to get closer to what the consensus or the majority view is. So that's why, again, we're not trying to do SDP, but we have done sketch plans that establish certain parameters that has to be exhibited at an SDP stage. So again, while we're not doing the design, so this is sort of where it's going. So with note 3, again, if the condition coming out of what I just heard was, the condition of approval would be from the council, application blah, blah, blah is, approved subject to the following conditions. Note 3 to be amended to specifically preclude sole development of a single building, single use. So it's these sort of things that we're trying to work at. So that's really the gist of notes 3, 4, and 5, is to figure out, how they may be tweaked in order to get closer to what the majority of council and planning commission's recommendation is striving for.
Okay, so the way forward now is to work with applicant or in some way propose conditions that will act on the currently submitted new sketch plan.
Correct.
Yeah, I would say it this way. Our process is about getting applications to a yes. And what staff is trying to do is get feedback from us, guidance from us, that they can go and work with the applicant to amend the application to get us to something we can vote yes on. That's what this is all about. Now, Rob, I don't know if it seemed that there were some comments in support of the mix of uses per our MXD zone. I think there seemed to be some support from council members for that as well. I don't know, did you register, were you taking notes on, count on that, where we are on that question?
No, so if Laura, you know the page number so we can go to the note 4.
Sure, let me.
47.
Look that up real quick. So I did hear some conflicting things. Sounds like some were in support of these percentages, which are what are allowed in the MXD zone currently. And then I also heard support for economic development's proposed percentages, which do differ from these.
So again, coming back to note 3, if the agreement has been not to develop the site solely with one building and one use, there's 2 ways to look at these percentages. Do you support, we obviously support, a single building with multiple uses, or do you support multiple buildings with a single use? Because that's going to drive then these percentages. If the council and planning commission with their recommendation support multiple buildings with a single use, then the notes as presented by the applicant should stand, allowing 100%.
That's not what I was hearing from the council. I was hearing from the council that there was a support for a mix of uses. Whether those were the ratios that were laid out by the economic development team or by the MXD zone, I didn't hear clarity on that. But that there was more than one use, I think I was hearing from council members. Can we very quickly just speak to that? Just go from council member through each council member and hear your point on that. So we'll start. I'm going to start with Councilmember Harris.
Why me?
Do you support multiple uses? Would you require that there be multiple uses on this property or no?
Yes.
Okay. Councilmember Sales.
Yes.
Councilmember Sesma.
Multiple uses.
Councilmember Wu.
Yeah, I think the best use would be multiple uses on the site.
Councilmember Spiegel.
I agree, but again, I don't really understand why we need to tie our hands to answer that question at this early phase in the process. But I agree, the best use would be multiple uses.
Okay.
So the question that we are seeking guidance on is, because we've resolved this, the 100%'s out the window. You know, do you support the percentage breakdown as defined in the code or as proposed by economic development? Or, and I know this will be a wormhole, a third one that we will vet through and somehow come up and show cause for this evening. Obviously, the easiest of the two is either go with the code or go with economic development.
Well, can we not just leave it as a mix of uses and let the professionals, maybe the planning commission, weigh in on how the specific breakdown, the ratios are? John Schlichting, let me ask you this question.
Yeah, I'm thinking, yeah, absolutely.
Why do we have to come up with percentages here at the dais? Thank you. Okay, are there any other pending questions that will help this process move forward and make clear?
One last one, I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor, on this one. Again, just to be clear, is council in support that whatever percentages Planning Commission recommends and brings forward and you deliberate at your policy discussion is to be reflected at preliminary subdivision, at SDP?
Can you repeat that question?
Again, this is, you know, the debate of, do you base whatever the percentage may be to be debated at policy discussion is based upon 650,000, or is it based upon what is actually submitted for review at SDP? So the 10% as in the staff report, you know, are you granting them 65,000 square feet by right? Or if they come in with 100,000 square feet, are they limited to 10,000 square feet, a true 10%?
Got it. Council members.
I think this is why we use the floor as guidance. And I think the recommended, the recommended percentages are definitely, I think we should look at as the floor and room for guidance. And yeah.
Okay. Councilmember Sesma.
All right, the question again is whether those percentages in the zone are what we want, or whether we're going to be flexible about those as the floor, or the, as Lorianne just suggested, or the cap. I guess I do agree with the economic development team's recommendations that that commercial institutional actually might be a little low on the low end, so that should be the floor for that. That means that the other ones, one of the other ones is going to have to swing, usually retail in that case. So I guess I'm willing to adopt. I don't know that we need that level of specificity at this point, but if I'm forced to do that, I would go with the economic development team recommendations on that.
Rob, I'm not sure that actually speaks to the question you're getting at.
Yeah, I'm just asking, you know, how it's applied at the next stage.
well, I thought we had some flexibility here, and also the note, one of the note 4 says any one of those percentages may be exceeded for good cause shown. So, you know, I'm assuming that that applies to how we would look at this and how the commission would look at this. Can you explain that? For note 4.
Yes. So again, as Laura laid out, mixed-use development zone for these 3 broad use categories have ceilings that ensure a mix of uses. Those percentages can be exceeded for good cause shown by council. The question that we're asking right now is, you know, before heading into SDP, do you wish, you know, do you feel they have given good cause shown? You know, again, if we don't want to establish the percentages at this point and just make an acknowledgement that nothing's to be 100%, because we've already said because of note 3 it can't be, but we don't know what the percentage is and you can judge it at SDP. I'm fine with that. It just has to be made clear, you know, again, that the applicant will have to come in at SDP with a statement justifying their mix shown. I'm fine. That's an alternative we didn't necessarily put forward, you know, but I think that's a solution maybe to this issue.
I think that, you know, based on our experience with this zone, we can be flexible and allow the applicant to come up with a reasonable plan and show cause for why that makes sense for their particular project. So I don't know that we need to have firm numbers here. I think the zone already provides some guidance, and if one of those zones is too low, another one's too high, then it's up to I think we can allow the applicant to propose and show cause why that's the case and how they would formulate the percentages differently.
Okay, let's go to John Bauer.
So since we'll move into we've established another meeting on our calendar to help expedite this and get our recommendation back to you probably more quickly than we would have otherwise given the summer schedule. It'll probably be the only thing we discuss that night. If we're looking at a recommendation on this application, it sounds, just taking us at face value, maybe Rob, this is to you, there is a proposal for percentages on this application, right? So the recommendation discussions would be something along the lines of, and I'm not going to come to a conclusion, but would be a conversation would go something like, well, we recommend that there be no percentages on here and that we address that at SDP. Is that where this is headed, do you think?
That is possible, unless because of the discussion with note 3, note 4 just be amended that, you know, any use category can't be 100%, but you haven't determined what that percentage is. We can punt that to SDP, to Councilmember Sesma's point, and as Lynn has brought up, and debated under the merits of the findings of an SDP.
Right. Okay. So assuming, just imagine that's a scenario, then Councilman Sesma, does that sound consistent with what you were just talking about?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the final rule is nothing's 100%. Nothing can be 100%. So,
but there isn't something
you got to swing within that between the 3 options, and propose why that's what's going to work for them.
Yeah,
and how that's the single best use, or how that is the best use.
And clearly, anything that's not the 100, you know, 99 to 1%, it's got to be meaningful, whatever that other chunk is,
of course,
in a way that can be manifest on a plan, right? So,
because anything over 65%, they must give a justification that these 2 bodies say has shown good cause for that going above 65%.
It's my expectation that staff will provide the appropriate advice should something like that occur.
Right. Okay. Very good.
All right. Do I see any other hands up? Otherwise, I feel like staff is guided at this point, and want to thank everybody for being part of this meeting. And
we have one more. I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor. Well, one, I think Councilmember Wu had one additional comment, and then we have note 5, and then I promise we're done.
Okay, Councilmember Wu.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. The hand went up, then it sort of went down once Judd seemed like he was moving on, because that means that it's like 10 o'clock already. But just to clarify on the prior point about the 100%, and my answer is that I believe the best use is a mix of uses on the property. However, I also believe that if the applicant can justify the 100% use, I would consider it. So it's a mood issue now, I think, because of what I'm hearing from everyone else, but I just wanted to clarify that. And that clarification then kind of informs my answer to the next one, which is kind of where Mike is that, you know, in adopting percentages, whatever the case may be, if the applicant can justify its mixes above or above the certain thresholds, then I would want the discretion to be able to consider that.
Okay, Rob Robinson.
Yes. So the last one with note 5, I think we've received our answer. I just want to affirm, essentially based upon the discussion now of, you know, how we want to, you know, change note 4 and the definitive discussion on note 3. I don't necessarily see an issue with note 5 necessarily as written, that, you know, it can be, you know, again, if to Councilmember Sesma's point, if they come in with an SDP for the entire site, that's a single phase. If they build it in such a way that they don't necessarily feel like subdividing, you know, I don't have personally, I don't have an issue with that either. And because of, to Councilmember Sesma and Spiegel's points about affording flexibility at SDP, I don't see why we wouldn't support potentially shifting density between the blocks, quote unquote. So I think as long as the recommendation coming out is a strong note 3, it precludes any of the concerns related to note 5. So I believe note 5 can stand. And I'm hoping that is the consensus view.
I'm looking for hands as we all try to figure out, you know, when you say speaking, this is note, we support note 3, but not note 4, but with a little of note 5 and sprinkle a little of note 2 in there. Look, we need to speak with a little bit more clarity here, Rob.
Sorry.
So I'm going to go to Ryan first, and then Rob, and then we'll all try to go back and catch up with all these shorthands. Go ahead, Ryan.
I think Rob Robinson's last comment is correct insofar as being okay with note 5 doesn't mean that we surrender any of our authority at the SDP phase to be more specific in talking about, you know, where things should be and what should be where. But I don't think we do, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we do simply by agreeing to the language in note 5 at this point.
Okay, who else wants to weigh in on this? Rob Wu.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an issue with note 5 or the shifting of densities between the sites, so long as it's not utilized as a tool to shift all the density to one of the sites. So there is a meaningful consideration of density on both of the blocks.
Anything else from other council members?
I'm in agreement with Rob and Ryan.
Can I just ask?
John Bauer.
Thanks. Rob, essentially the 2 versions of note 5 just adds a little bit of a hazy follow-up about the applicant combining the blocks on the second version of it. What's the real issue there? Just like cut to the chase. What's the concern?
Consolidation, you know, so here's my difficulty. Candidly, if you consolidate the blocks, yeah, you know, the early discussion, even though we're not debating Amazon, it facilitates that. But it also, if you look at like the Monument Campus, before they carved out Kaiser Permanente, that was multiple buildings on a single lot. So, you know, my concern is, again, as we've said from the beginning, we're not debating Amazon tonight. You know, we're looking at land uses. So, you know, I don't think necessarily we have a problem if there's multiple buildings on a single parcel.
Right.
So that's really where this note, you know, comes in. So to say you must have 2 blocks, you know, again, to what I think a common theme that I'm hearing is that's more of an SDP issue. It should be taken up at SDP. So to afford the flexibility at this stage to develop under a single phase with a single lot, as long as it's meeting these other things, you know, let that be argued at schematic development plan.
So having said that, which of the 2 versions of note 5 are you moving forward with then?
Well, again, it's the one that, we have, I think it's the one on the plan itself.
The revised or the previous?
So the revised note 5, I think, just adds clarity that they can develop in one block versus 2 blocks. If the tech team wants to bring up page 51, that does show the revised note if you want to take a look at it. So really they just added that last sentence
Right.
to sort of add clarity that they can develop in a single block.
So, no, I don't support that note 5 based on what staff is, I guess, making sense of this statement. If they are able to consolidate, they can build on that one parcel, one single use building, regardless of who the tenant is.
Okay. Other council members. Mike Sesma.
I think I already said where I was.
Okay, Neil Harris.
Yes. I really don't have a strong opinion on this one, so I'm just happy to go with the majority.
Okay, it seems like we're leaving the revised note 5 as is. Rob. Okay, now before we go, I wanted to invite Brian and Phil back. Tech team, if you could bring Brian and Phil back if they had any final statements that they wanted to make vis-a-vis our discussion here. Welcome back, guys. You're on mute right now.
There we go. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, so it was great discussion. And the first thing I'd like to address is this by right in the I3 zone, or the interpretation of the by right. Granted, it's not a written code, nor is multiple buildings in the code as it relates to I3. But I'm like John, I'm just going to keep this real simple. What we did is we researched the I3 zone, and we researched the E1 zone, which are permitted right uses permitted in the I3. Our research was done through CoStar, and CoStar is a vehicle that everybody uses. Sharon uses it, Tom uses it, so you can fact check us. But we took the additional step and used the City of Gaithersburg GIS system to cross-reference the data that we got off CoStar. So I'm pretty confident with the data that we collected, and it's very telling. I also have a package of each of the properties along with a plat that shows the individual properties that I'll submit to the record so you'll have it. But I'll just give you the summary. The I3, and Sharon and Tom, when you look at this, make sure you type in I-3 and then I3. Same with E1. If you don't, you won't gather all the data. But in the I3 zone, according to CoStar, there are 25 properties zoned I3. Of those 25 properties, 12 of those properties are single building, single lot. That's one building, one lot. Of those 12 buildings, 6 of those buildings are single building, single lot, single tenant. So let me repeat that. There's 25 properties owned I3. 12 of those properties are single building, single lot. 6 of those 12 are single building, single lot, single tenant. The city of Gaithersburg has been approving single building, single lot, single tenant buildings since 1968. The most recent approval was in 2017. And many of you that sit on the council today were part of that approval. If you go to the E1 zone, there's a total of 40 properties in the E1 zone, according to CoStar. Of those 40 properties, 24 are single building, single lot. Of those 24 buildings, 4 of those buildings are single building on a single lot with a single tenant.
So I don't want to go on with this all night. I think we understand the point you're making. Do you have any other points you'd like to get to?
Yeah, my point is that I'm looking for the city of Gaithersburg to be consistent. Since 1968, you have approved single buildings on single lots with a single use. So why now do we get away from being consistent? We did look at the MXD zone. Unfortunately, it's a little bit more convoluted in that you have hospitality, you have office, you have multifamily, you have a bunch of those. But the one that really came to light was the MedImmune site. That's a 22-acre site. It's debatable if it's one use, but it did have multiple buildings. It had one office building and lab buildings along with parking decks, but the lab buildings are all interconnected. The office building itself is separate, but it's on one lot. But multiple buildings, debatable whether it's one use. So again, what we're looking for is the city just to have a little bit of consistency based on the data that we were able to achieve. So I think at this point, I'll turn it, I don't see Mark up there. Yeah, can we get Mark Matten on the screen?
Tech team, please bring up Mark Matten. Welcome, Mark. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, but please feel free.
Sure. Again, thank you, everybody. Last time I opened up, I guess I'll close this time due to some technical issues, but this is pretty simple. Mr. Mayor, you asked earlier why we're here. And John, you hit it right on the head. I spent the time, the money to submit an STP that did not specifically say whether there was a single building allowed, a single use allowed. So at recommendation of staff, I went back and I'm here in front of you today, and a lot of you are saying, well, now just go back to the STP. And in a nutshell, and again, I gave, as Judd, you referred to my monologue in the last one, but I am a son, a believer, and an investor in Gaithersburg. I'm not an adversary. I'm a true believer in Gaithersburg. But I will tell you, if I started this meeting with a box this big for this property and what I can do with it over time, because that's what a sketch plan is supposed to do, I feel like the box is about this big now. It just, from percentages to uses, I wish I had the ability in any of the markets to dictate the uses at any given time in the flow of the discussion you guys are having. So anything short of, like you said, Lorianne, giving the sites like this the ability to go to 100% is crazy. It doesn't work. The other thing is, at any given time, X use is popular, then Y use is popular, and we can't dictate when that comes or when they come in. And if it's not based on the total gross area, then I can bring you one retail use, one warehouse use, one lab use. And if it's based on my submission and it's only 65% of my submission, I can't even build the one use I brought you if you do the math. So it is it's interesting. Rob Robertson, I have one question for you. Very simple. Given my current approved sketch plan, can I build a single use, multiple building development on this site?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Yes.
So I can build a single use, multiple building development.
Yes, that was the crux, I gather, what the issue was. And while I did not review your STP, I understand that was the crux of the conversation about amending the sketch.
Okay, so with that being said, FedEx would be considered a single use, multiple building. Is that what you said earlier?
That's what it is.
Okay. So if I brought you a biotech company tomorrow that was in 3 buildings, regardless of size, because FedEx is 320,000 feet and 4,000 foot guardhouse. Regardless of size, you're saying that under my current sketch plan, I'm allowed to do that.
I believe so. Again, I don't have your sketch right in front of me, but I gather those were the issues.
Okay. So make sure everyone hears that. Because back to our, I consider somewhat famous coffee, Lorianne. We can debate uses, and I'm okay with that. But over a span of time, there are large uses like biotech uses, Tom. And again, like we spoke before, they don't want to necessarily share the property for security reasons and lots of other reasons. And thus, there are multiple examples of single tenant, multiple buildings on sites like this. So, and Tom and Sharon, both of you guys, as an investor in Gaithersburg or investor anywhere else, the number one rule for me is I need to know the rules. And the rules can't change as I come, because it sounds easy to say, hey, Mark, bring us the deal at the STP. But John, as you know, I'm 6 months in with a tenant by the time I get to STP. Could be millions of dollars in. It can't be that loosey-goosey. It doesn't work. And so there needs to be clarity, because we're supposed to be working together. And so we will go back after this. And Rob, you've been the most clear with me, and I will try to work with that. The other thing for everybody here tonight, to have Broderick and Natalie come, it is Amazon, and it's important to Gaithersburg. It's important to Montgomery County. And the last meeting we had, I know everybody wants to be general in this meeting, there were specific questions asked to me, articles written that, hey, Mark, why aren't you talking about the user? I brought the user here today. They took the time to come. It's awesome. Not one question was asked of them, but when they weren't here, there was questions asked of them. So I'll leave that out there, but I'm telling you, they're here because they're also a believer in Gaithersburg. So I really appreciate it, because as we all know, and as it'll all happen tomorrow, Amazon will be part of our lives tomorrow, all of us. And we need them part of our community. And the other thing that hasn't been mentioned from the beginning, Tom and Sharon, to this meeting is, hey, how do we make this work? Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I know we're under a moratorium of talking to me now, but prior to this, I've invited all of you to a lot of meetings and discussions. I haven't gotten one call that said, Mark, come here. We want to work with you. We want you to invest in Gaithersburg. So I will leave it at, Rob, I'm very clear on what you said. And 2, again, I'm a son, a believer, and an investor in Gaithersburg. I'm working with some of the best tenants in the country, and I want to work with Gaithersburg. And I don't want it to be adversarial. I really want to work with you. I want to get this thing populated and people working. And it's that simple. And I appreciate your time. And I'm welcome to answer any of your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. With that, I think we've given staff guidance, and I expect that the Matin team will hear from our staff, and there'll be some back and forth, and we'll look forward to that. I do want to thank the representatives from Amazon for being here. As I explained before, as we consider a sketch plan, it's not the particular tenant that could come to the, could result, could come to the city as a result of the approval of a sketch plan goes beyond the scope of what should be in our record and what we should be making our decisions on. So that's why there were no questions directed to Amazon, but we very much appreciate their interest and belief in the city and for being here. And with that, I will close us by saying the next regular meeting of the Mayor and City Council is next Monday, August 3rd. As I mentioned before, we have 2 executive sessions right after this, or 1 executive session with 2 topics. So until next time, let's do great things, Gaithersburg. We are adjourned.